Munich, West Germany, September 4th, 1972. The sun had barely set when the laughter started. Inside the Olympic Village, thousands of athletes from 121 nations were eating together, dancing together, trading pins and photos and broken phrases of each other's languages. An American sprinter taught a Romanian gymnast how to moonwalk. A Japanese judoka shared dumplings with a Kenyan long-distance runner. For 2 weeks, the world had agreed, even if just for a moment, to stop being enemies. And nobody noticed the man in the kitchen. Nobody noticed the engineer drawing maps. Nobody noticed that 2 strangers had been walking these same streets for months, memorizing every gate, every corridor, every blind spot in the fence. They weren't here to watch the games. They were here to end them. What happened in Munich in the early hours of September 5th, 1972, would shatter the myth of the peaceful Olympics and send shockwaves through history that are still being felt today. This is not just a story about terrorism. It is a story about blind trust, catastrophic failure, and 11 men who never came home. It is a story that the world watched live on television and got completely wrong. To understand why Munich mattered so much, you have to go back 36 years. In 1936, Adolf Hitler turned the Berlin Olympics into the greatest propaganda event in modern history. He used the Games to show the world a clean, disciplined, racially superior Germany, while Jewish citizens were being quietly stripped of their rights outside the stadium walls. Now, in 1972, West Germany was desperate to rewrite that story. They named these games something that still sounds almost painfully innocent: the Games of Peace and Joy. The logo was bright, the mascot was cheerful, the security was intentionally light. Yes, intentionally. West German officials made a conscious decision. Armed guards and checkpoints would remind the world of the Nazi past. So instead, they built a village that felt open, friendly, free. The fence around the entire Olympic Village was 6 feet tall, just 6 feet, and it had no electric sensors, no cameras, no guards stationed at every point. Athletes would routinely hop over it late at night to go drink at Munich bars, and the security guards would wave them through when they returned. This was the utopia West Germany had built. And into that utopia, 8 men were about to walk, carrying AK-47 rifles in their sports bags. For the Israeli delegation, arriving in Munich was not a simple thing. This was the same German soil where, just 30 years earlier, 6 million Jewish people had been systematically murdered. The Olympic Village in Munich sat just 16 kilometers from Dachau, one of the most notorious Nazi concentration camps. Every step the Israeli athletes took in this city carried weight that athletes from other nations simply could not feel. And yet, they came, in greater numbers than ever before. 22 Israelis in total: athletes, coaches, officials, wrestlers, weightlifters, shooters, fencers. They came because they believed in what the Munich Games stood for, because they wanted to prove that Jewish people could compete as equals on the world stage, even on this particular stage. But not everyone was comfortable. Shmuel Lalkin, the head of the Israeli Olympic delegation, had noticed the security gap from day one. He formally requested additional protection for his team. The request was denied. The games of peace and joy could not afford to look like they needed armed protection. Lalkin's concern was filed away, forgotten, and the Israeli athletes settled into apartments 1 through 6 at 31 Connollystrasse, completely unaware that 2 men had already stood outside that building and taken notes about its layout. His name was Lutif Afif, but inside the operation, everyone called him Issa. He was the architect of what was coming. Issa was a member of Black September, a Palestinian militant organization that had emerged from the wreckage of the 1970s civil war in Jordan, when thousands of Palestinian fighters were expelled from the country in a bloody crackdown. Black September took its name from that month, September 1970, a month of massacre and displacement that had hardened certain men into something beyond ordinary rage. But what made Issa different from a typical militant was this: he was patient, methodical, terrifyingly calm. Months before the Olympics, he came to Munich under a false identity. He got a job as a civil engineer, and he used that access to study every inch of the Olympic Village, the entry points, the blind spots, the distance between buildings, the rhythm of the guards' movements. His deputy, Yusuf Nazal, codenamed Tony, came separately. He found work as a cook inside the village. He watched, listened, mapped. Together, they knew exactly which building the Israelis were in. They knew which apartments. They knew the fence could be climbed. They knew the best time to move. 4 in the morning, when the guards were tired, when the athletes were deep in sleep, when the whole world was dreaming. They had 8 men. They had AK-47s, pistols, and hand grenades. They had a plan. And on the night of September 4th, they put on tracksuits to look like athletes and began walking toward Gate 25A. It was 4:10 in the morning. The Olympic Village was silent. No music, no laughter, just the distant hum of a city sleeping. 8 men in tracksuits approached the perimeter fence near Gate 25A. They carried sports bags over their shoulders. To anyone watching, they looked exactly like athletes sneaking back in after a night out. In fact, that's exactly what a group of American athletes thought they were. The Americans were also returning late. They saw the men at the fence, assumed they were fellow competitors, and helped them climb over, boosting their bags. The Americans laughed, wished them good night, and walked away. Inside those bags, AK-47 assault rifles, pistols, hand grenades, spare magazines, and a list with the numbers of specific apartments. The 8 men moved quickly through the dark, staying close to the walls, avoiding the few lights that were on. Within minutes, they were standing at the door of apartment 1, 31 Connollystrasse. Issa produced a duplicate key. The lock resisted slightly. There was a small scraping sound. Inside, wrestling referee Josef Gutfreund heard it. He would become the first line of defense that no one had planned for. Josef Gutfreund was a large man. 135 kilograms of solid muscle and bone, built by decades of wrestling. He stirred, listened, heard the scratching at the lock. He crossed the room and reached the door just as it began to open. and in the crack of the doorframe he saw them. Men, weapons, black masks. In one instant, Gutfreund processed the entirety of what was happening. He threw himself against the door, all 135 kilograms, and he screamed, in Hebrew, as loud as he could, "Guys, run! Get out!" He bought perhaps 10 seconds, maybe 15. 8 armed men pushing against a door held by a single unarmed man. But those seconds mattered. Wrestling coach Tuvia Sokolovsky heard him and escaped through a back window into the darkness. Then the door gave way. The men flooded in. Wrestling coach Moshe Weinberg grabbed a kitchen knife and lunged at Isa. He nearly hit him. He was shot, but not fatally. Not yet. Weinberg, bleeding, barely standing, made a choice in that moment that would define what followed. He looked at the terrorists, and he lied. Moshe Weinberg knew something the terrorists didn't. He knew which apartments held the strongest men on the Israeli team. When the terrorists ordered him to lead them to the other Israeli rooms, Weinberg deliberately walked them away from apartment 2, where shooters and referees were sleeping, and toward apartment 3. Apartment 3 held 6 weightlifters and wrestlers, men with iron bodies and combat instincts. Weinberg was betting that if anyone could overwhelm 8 gunmen in close quarters, it was them. He was trying to start a fight he thought they could win. Weightlifter Yosef Romano didn't hesitate. The moment the terrorists entered, he attacked, disabling one of them, slamming him into the wall. In the chaos, wrestler Gad Sobari bolted, running through a tunnel beneath the building, escaping into the Munich night. Weinberg, bleeding from his gunshot wound, saw his chance and threw himself at another attacker, hammering him with his fists until the man crumpled. For a few seconds, just a few extraordinary seconds, the Israeli athletes were winning. Then the guns fired. Moshe Weinberg and Yosef Romano were killed. The fight was over. 9 Israelis were bound, beaten, and taken hostage. It was 4:30 in the morning. The 1972 Munich Olympics had just become something else entirely. By dawn, the news was everywhere. Television cameras that had been set up to broadcast the 100-meter dash and the gymnastics finals were now pointed at an apartment building where 9 people were being held at gunpoint. ABC sports anchor Jim McKay, who had come to Munich to cover sprinters and swimmers, found himself anchoring the most watched hostage crisis in television history. Across the world, people sat in front of their sets in complete silence. Some had never even heard of the Olympic Games before. Now they couldn't look away. And at 9:30 that morning, the terrorists announced their demands. They wanted 234 Palestinian prisoners released from Israeli jails. They wanted 2 imprisoned West German militants freed. And they wanted safe passage to an Arab country, or the hostages would die. To show they were serious, they threw Moshe Weinberg's body into the street below the apartment window. In Jerusalem, Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir was given the list of 234 names. She refused, without hesitation, without negotiation. Not 234, not 1. Her reasoning was brutal and clear. If Israel gave in once, Hostage-taking would become a permanent weapon against Israeli citizens everywhere in the world. She offered the West Germans something different. Let Israeli special forces fly in and handle the rescue operation themselves. West Germany refused that too. And so the standoff began. Here is something that gets forgotten in most retellings of Munich 1972. While 9 human beings were being held hostage inside an apartment, while negotiators were scrambling, while the world held its breath, the Olympic Games continued. Not immediately beside the building, but in tracks and pools and gymnasiums across the same city, the same morning. The International Olympic Committee decided that stopping the Games would be giving in to terrorism. So runners ran. Swimmers swam. Cyclists pedaled. Medals were awarded. Many athletes refused. They withdrew. They sat in their rooms and stared at the walls. But the official machinery kept turning. It was one of the most surreal moments in the history of sport, and it raises a question that nobody has ever cleanly answered. When human lives are in the balance, does competition still matter? The 9 hostages would not have had an answer to that question. They were running out of time. At 4:30 in the afternoon, West Germany launched its first rescue attempt. They called it Operation Sunshine. The plan? Send armed police officers through the ventilation shafts in the roof, drop into the apartment from above, neutralize the terrorists before they could harm the hostages. It might have worked, except the television cameras were already rolling. Cameramen positioned on rooftops across the village captured every second of the police moving into position, in full body armor, weapons drawn, and broadcast it live. Inside the apartment, the terrorists were watching television. Issa walked to the window, looked up, and called off the rescue himself, threatening to execute a hostage immediately if the officers on the roof didn't stand down. West German authorities had no choice. They ordered the police to retreat. It was a failure so complete it almost defies description. The rescue attempt had been broadcast to the very people it was trying to surprise. Now the terrorists knew West Germany was lying to them. They demanded something new. Get them out of Munich entirely. Fly them and the hostages to Cairo. West Germany agreed, but it was another lie. There would be no flight to Cairo. There would be an ambush at the airport. Before the terrorists and hostages were moved, West German Interior Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher and Olympic Village Mayor Walter Troger asked to enter the apartment, officially to check on the hostages. Their real purpose was intelligence. They needed to know exactly how many terrorists they were dealing with. They counted 5. There were 8. 3 had stayed in back rooms out of sight. Genscher and Troger left believing they had the correct number. They reported 5 terrorists. That single miscalculation would poison every decision that followed. The rescue plan being assembled at Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base, some 25 kilometers outside Munich, was designed around 5 attackers, 5 sniper positions, 5 target assignments. 5 is a very different number than 8. Even when Munich Police Chief Manfred Schreiber finally learned the correct number, 8, during the transfer to the helicopters, he failed to relay that information to the team at the airbase. The men preparing the final rescue attempt would go into it not knowing how many enemies they were facing. And they would pay for that ignorance in blood. Just before midnight, 2 helicopters lifted off from the Olympic Village. Inside, 9 bound Israeli athletes, 8 armed terrorists, and 4 helicopter pilots whose lives had just become part of the equation. The hostages had been divided, some in one helicopter, some in the other. Keeping them apart made any rescue attempt twice as complicated. At Fürstenfeldbruck Air Base, a Lufthansa Boeing 727 sat on the tarmac with its engines running, the bait, the illusion of the Cairo flight. 5 police sharpshooters were positioned around the airfield, on the control tower roof, behind a concrete structure, in the grass near the runway. None of them had telescopic sights. None of them had night vision equipment. None of them had ever operated in a hostage rescue scenario. They were policemen who were good shots. That was the entirety of their qualification for this moment. Also watching, from a distance, powerless, were Mossad chief Tzvi Zamir and senior Israeli intelligence officer Victor Cohen. They had flown in from Tel Aviv on a commercial flight, desperate to contribute. West Germany wouldn't let them participate. The helicopters touched down at 10:30 p.m. The most catastrophic rescue attempt in Olympic history was about to begin. Issa and Tony stepped off the helicopter and walked toward the Boeing. The airfield was flooded with light, deliberately, to blind the terrorists and give the snipers clear sight lines. Issa climbed the stairs, stepped inside the plane, looked around. It was empty. No crew, no passengers, nothing. He knew. He turned and ran back toward the helicopters. The German officer in the control tower, Georg Wolf, gave the order to fire. The snipers opened up. 2 terrorists guarding the pilots were hit immediately. They fell. But then, everything went wrong. The remaining 6 terrorists, not the expected 3, sprinted for cover, returning fire with their AK-47s. Hand grenades began landing on the tarmac. The snipers had no backup, no armored vehicles, no stun grenades, no communications earpieces, no synchronized fire plan. For over an hour, a gunfight raged at Fürstenfeldbruck between police and terrorists, while 9 bound human beings sat inside helicopters in the crossfire. Then came the moment that ended everything. Surrounded, no escape. Issa pulled a grenade. At 12:04 a.m. on September 6, 1972, a grenade was thrown into one of the helicopters. It exploded. The helicopter burned. Seconds later, a second terrorist opened fire on the other helicopter with his AK-47, killing everyone inside. All 9 hostages were dead. Moshe Weinberg and Yosef Romano had already been killed in the village. 11 Israelis. 11 people who had come to Munich to compete, to carry their country's flag, to prove that Jewish athletes could stand on the world stage. All of them gone. 5 of the 8 terrorists were killed in the firefight. 3, Jamal al-Ghashi, Mohammed Safadi, and Adnan al-Ghashi, were captured wounded. At 3 a.m., a West German government spokesman appeared on television and announced that the hostages had been rescued. People around the world exhaled, cheered, went to sleep relieved. By morning, the real news had reached them. Jim McKay sat at his anchor desk, his voice barely held together as he said the words that became one of the most remembered sentences in sports broadcasting history. They're all gone. The aftermath of Munich was a slow-motion catastrophe. The Olympic Games were paused for 34 hours, then resumed. Many found that decision insulting. The Israeli athletes who had not been taken hostage packed their bags and went home, unwilling to compete, while their teammates' families were still identifying bodies. The post-mortems on West Germany's handling of the crisis were brutal. A government investigation concluded that the rescue attempt at Fürstenfeldbruck was plagued by poor intelligence, inadequate preparation, insufficient manpower, and a fundamental failure to involve counter-terrorism experts. Mossad chief Zvi Zamir, who watched every second of the airfield disaster from the control tower, stated plainly that what he witnessed was not a rescue operation. It was a disaster waiting to happen. But perhaps the most cynical moment came 6 weeks later. On October 29th, a Lufthansa flight was hijacked by Black September. The terrorists demanded the release of the 3 surviving Munich attackers from West German custody. West Germany released them immediately, without negotiation. The 3 men who had helped murder 11 Israeli athletes walked free in under 24 hours. Israel received no prior notice, no consultation, no apology. In Jerusalem, the anger had already crossed a threshold from grief into something colder, something that would last for decades. Israel did not mourn quietly. On September 8th, just 2 days after the massacre, Israeli Air Force jets struck 10 PLO bases in Syria and Lebanon. Over 200 people were killed, but that was only the beginning. Prime Minister Golda Meir authorized an operation with a name taken directly from divine judgment, Operation Wrath of God. Its mission? Find every individual who had planned, funded, or enabled the Munich Massacre, no matter where they were in the world, and kill them. Mossad assembled small teams of operatives and deployed them across Europe and the Middle East. In Rome, Wael Zweiter was shot 12 times in an elevator. In Paris, Mahmoud Hamshari answered his telephone, and it exploded. A device hidden in the base of his phone triggered remotely. In Cyprus, a hotel room was detonated in the night. Each target was shot 11 times, 1 bullet for each Israeli athlete who had died in Munich. Before each killing, the target's family reportedly received a bouquet of flowers and a note. The note always said the same thing: "We never forget. We never forgive." The operation continued for over 20 years. It is still disputed whether every target was correctly identified. One of the most painful chapters involved the killing of an innocent Moroccan waiter in Norway, a man mistaken for a Black September operative, which resulted in the only Mossad agents ever convicted of murder by a foreign court. Wrath of God was not clean. It was not precise. It was grief turned into policy, and it shaped Israeli counterterrorism doctrine for generations. The Munich Massacre didn't just kill 11 people. It changed the world. Within months of the attacks, West Germany created GSG-9, a dedicated counterterrorism unit unlike anything that had existed before. The unit went on to become one of the most respected special operations forces on the planet. Other nations followed. Britain's SAS expanded its hostage rescue capabilities. Israel's own special units developed new doctrines. The United States began building what would eventually become Delta Force. The 1972 Munich Massacre was in a horrifying sense, the birth moment of modern counter-terrorism as a discipline. Olympic security was transformed overnight. Armed guards, surveillance systems, perimeter sensors, background checks on staff. Everything that seemed oppressive and contrary to the Olympic spirit in 1972 became standard and non-negotiable. The games of peace and joy would never be possible again. And the Palestinian cause, which Black September had hoped to thrust into the global spotlight, did gain attention, but the price of that attention was paid entirely by 11 men who had nothing to do with politics. Men who were there to wrestle, to lift weights, to fence, to run. Men who wanted nothing more than to compete. History has a way of reducing tragedies to numbers. 11 dead, 8 terrorists, 21 hours, 34 hours before the games resumed. But these were not numbers, they had names. Moshe Weinberg, wrestling coach. He fought with a knife in his bare hands. He lied to save his friends. He died for it. Yosef Romano, weightlifter. He attacked a gunman with his hands. He bought others a chance to breathe. David Berger, weightlifter, born in America, competed for Israel, never went home. Ze'ev Friedman, weightlifter, the youngest of the weightlifters on the team. Josef Gutfreund, wrestling referee. He threw his body against a door and screamed so others could run. Kahat Shor, shooting coach, 63 years old. Andre Spitzer, fencing coach, married to a Dutch journalist who waited at the airport all night for a husband who never came. Amitsur Shapira, track and field coach, father of 4. Yakov Springer, weightlifting judge. Eliezer Helfen, wrestler. Mark Slavin, wrestler, 18 years old. He had been in Israel for only a few months, having emigrated from the Soviet Union just that year. 18 years old. He had just arrived in the country he had always dreamed of. He had just made the Olympic team. He had just begun. And then the door opened in the dark, and everything ended. For 4 decades, the families of the 11 athletes had a simple request. They wanted a minute of silence at the opening ceremony of every Olympic Games that followed Munich. 1 minute, in memory of their loved ones. The International Olympic Committee refused every time. The official reason, repeated year after year, the Olympics should not be used for political statements. The families, who had lost husbands, fathers, sons, could not understand how remembering the dead was a political act. Finally, at the 2016 Rio Olympics, 44 years after Munich, the IOC held a moment of silence for the 11. 44 years. Anki Spitzer, the widow of fencing coach Andre Spitzer, had fought for that moment for 4.5 decades. She was there in Rio when it finally happened. She said it felt like relief. Not closure, there is no such thing, but relief. The world had finally acknowledged, officially and publicly, that 11 people who had come to compete in peace had been murdered. It took 44 years to say, "We remember." Munich 1972 is 50 years behind us, and yet it still feels like an open wound. Not because terrorism is unsolved, though it is. Not because the Middle East conflict is unresolved, though it is, but because Munich forces us to ask a question that we still haven't answered. What are the Olympics actually for? Are they a space where politics disappear? Where nations that hate each other agree for 2 weeks to compete instead of fight? Or is that idea always a lie, always a performance? The 1972 Munich Olympics were supposed to prove that Germany had changed, that the world had changed, that sport could be a substitute for war. And for 9 days, the illusion held. On the 10th day, 8 men in tracksuits climbed a 6-foot fence, and the illusion ended. The 11 men who died in Munich did not die for politics. They did not die for ideology. They died because they were Jewish, because they were Israeli, because they were there. Their names are carved into the wall at the Munich Olympic site. If you visit today, you can touch the stone. 11 names, 11 lives. The games of peace and joy. Remember what that cost.